On February 27th, 2022, she arrived in Indonesia with a rare sense of happiness, believing she had finally stepped into a new beginning after years of emptiness. She unpacked slowly, letting the comfort of her excitement settle in, convinced she had made the right choice. That night, while he stepped outside for a moment, she noticed a video file open on his laptop. Curiosity led her to click it, and the face of a known serial killer filled the screen. As the man in the clip spoke, she felt her chest tighten. The phrases he used, the tone of his explanations, the cold logic behind his crimes. They were the exact words her host had spoken to her earlier that evening. Before she could close the video or pull herself away from the desk, she sensed someone behind her. She turned, and he stood there in the doorway, watching her with an expression she had not seen until that moment. The happiness she carried into the country evaporated, replaced by a fear she couldn't outrun. Alone, far from home, she knew the next few seconds would decide everything. What did she do next? What happened in that house? And did she find a way out? Or did she become the next woman who never made it back? Dallas, Texas. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. 2021. The sun had already begun to fade over the quiet suburbs of Oak Cliff when Marilyn Ford sat by her kitchen window, stirring the same cup of coffee she'd made 2 hours earlier. The house felt heavier now, quieter than it used to be. The laughter of her husband, gone for nearly a decade, no longer echoed down the hallways. The framed photographs on the wall, her in her crisp white nurse's uniform, her late husband beside her, her daughter Celeste as a little girl holding her hand, had become memories of a life she once tended to, but no longer lived in. At 62, Marilyn had cared for strangers in trauma wards, children in pain, and husbands fading away from illness. Yet, when it came to herself, she had nothing left to give. Her heart was full of other people's stories, but empty of her own. Her retirement had been meant to bring peace, but instead, it brought silence. She spent her mornings watering her plants, her afternoons reading travel blogs, and her evenings sitting by a muted television. It wasn't that she didn't have people who loved her. Celeste called every week. Her church friends visited sometimes. But loneliness has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks in routine. That's when she joined an online forum for retirees who loved to travel. It was simple, harmless, a space for people to talk about destinations they dreamed of visiting. And somewhere in between posts about Bali sunsets and Bangkok street food, she saw a comment that caught her attention. Paradise isn't a place. It's a feeling you share with someone who sees you. The name under it read Arka Wibowo. He was 33 from Indonesia, and unlike most of the men who messaged her, he didn't talk about her looks. He asked about her day, her years in nursing, the patients who'd changed her life. He called her my Queen of Mercy. It sounded dramatic, maybe even foolish, but the way he said it made her feel seen again. They began messaging every day, long conversations that stretched late into the night. He'd tell her about his love for art, about growing up near the ocean, about losing his father young and learning to survive on his own. His words carried warmth and rhythm, and Marilyn, who had spent a lifetime fixing the broken, found herself drawn to someone who spoke like he understood healing. Her daughter Celeste noticed the change almost immediately. "You're glowing again, Mom," she'd say half-jokingly, but behind her laughter was worry. Celeste was protective. She had seen too many stories of people scammed or hurt by strangers online. Marilyn dismissed it, saying, "Not everyone on the internet is dangerous, honey. Some people are just lonely, like me." Celeste didn't push further, but she never stopped watching. She noticed how her mother began checking her phone during dinner, how she smiled at the screen like she used to when her late husband sent her flowers to the hospital. For the first time in years, Marilyn felt alive, seen, wanted, and young again. But what she didn't know was that loneliness is often the quietest way a trap begins to close. Marilyn's relationship with Arka grew fast, almost too fast. Within weeks, he was calling her every morning before she made her coffee. He'd tell her, "You've worked your whole life taking care of others. Let me take care of you now." She laughed, saying she didn't need anyone's care, but secretly, she liked hearing it. Arca had a way of making ordinary words sound like promises. He began sending her photos. Him at a beach, him sketching in his apartment, him with friends at a local cafe. But when she looked closely, some of the pictures didn't match. In one, his hair was longer. In another, the background didn't fit the description he gave. When she asked, he brushed it off with charm. "Old pictures, my queen. I change like the seasons." She let it slide, telling herself that small inconsistencies didn't mean deceit. After all, who would lie about something so innocent? Over time, his attention became her comfort. He knew exactly when she felt low. He'd say the right words before she could even express what she was feeling. If she mentioned missing her late husband, he'd respond with stories about grief and rebirth, telling her, "Pain teaches us where love hides." She began to share details she hadn't told anyone in years. Her fears about aging, her guilt over the lives she couldn't save in the hospital, her wish to see the world before she grew too frail to walk through it. Arca listened like her past mattered, like her scars were proof of a soul that deserved peace. It wasn't love at first sight. It was love at first understanding. Celeste, however, couldn't shake her unease. She once asked, "Mom, how much do you really know about him?" Marilyn sighed, saying, "Enough to know he's kind." But kindness can be a mask, and the internet is full of people who wear it perfectly. Celeste tried to search his name, but found almost nothing. His social media accounts were new, his photos sparse, and his job description, import and design consultant. So vague it led nowhere. She warned her mother, but Marilyn refused to live in suspicion. "You can't be scared of everyone, sweetheart," she said. "I deserve to be happy too." And she meant it. After a lifetime of putting others first, she believed she had finally found someone who wanted her happiness in return. Weeks turned into months, and by the end of summer, Arca was no longer just a name on a screen. He was a promise waiting across the ocean. He spoke about how peaceful life was in Indonesia, how kind the people were, and how beautiful the beaches looked under the evening sun. "Come see it for yourself," he said one night. "Let me show you where I belong, and where you could too." The thought thrilled her and frightened her at once. She told Celeste, who nearly dropped her coffee mug. "You're not seriously considering this," she said. Marilyn smiled softly. "I've spent 62 years playing it safe. Maybe it's time I live a little before I can anymore." Marilyn believed she was walking toward something gentle, something healing. But life has a cruel way of twisting faith into fate. There were clues she didn't see. The way Arca's story shifted each time he spoke about his family. The way he avoided video calls longer than a few minutes. The strange echo behind his voice when he called late at night. Still, she ignored them, telling herself that love doesn't need proof, only patience. By early November, Arca sent her a plane ticket. He told her he wanted to meet her before Christmas, to celebrate life, and maybe plan a future together. The message came with a photo of him holding a handwritten note that said, "See you soon, my queen." She printed it and pinned it to her fridge, the same spot where she used to keep her husband's notes from years ago. It wasn't foolishness. It was faith. She believed in kindness because she had built her entire life on it. But as she began packing her suitcase, folding her favorite summer dress, her travel Bible, and her camera, she couldn't have known that this was not a journey toward love, but toward a trap crafted by someone who studied human empathy, the way others study anatomy. Arca had been watching her online for nearly a year, selecting her from hundreds of forum posts. He admired her profession, her compassion, her vulnerability. To him, she wasn't a person. She was a project. He once told her, "I've always been fascinated by the way people trust." It sounded poetic then. Later, it would sound like a confession. On the night before her flight, Celeste stayed over. They ate takeout, watched an old movie, and laughed until tears welled in their eyes. "Mom," Celeste said softly, "just promise you'll call me when you land." Marilyn squeezed her hand and said, "Always." But even then, her daughter noticed something. The excitement in her mother's eyes wasn't just joy. It was relief, like someone finally stepping out of a shadow after too many years of standing still. The story of Marilyn Ford isn't about recklessness. It's about hope. The kind of hope that blinds logic when the heart has been quiet too long. Her story is shared by thousands of others who look for connection in a world that often forgets them. But unlike most, Marilyn's choice would lead her to a place where compassion met cruelty. And as we look back now, every small red flag she brushed aside stands like a warning carved in hindsight. The blurred photos, the vague job, the sudden affection that felt too perfect to question. Each one whispered the same silent truth she couldn't bring herself to hear. Some people study love not to feel it, but to use it. Have you ever ignored a red flag because your heart wanted to believe the best? Because in Marilyn's case, that belief was about to cost her everything. If this story touches you, take a moment to share it. Because sometimes, the greatest act of care isn't healing a wound, but helping someone avoid it. For months he had painted vivid pictures of his homeland. Crystal blue water, soft white sand, palm trees swaying under golden light. He spoke of quiet villages and ocean sunsets that looked like fire melting into the horizon. He told her he wanted to hold her hand while they walked along the shore, to cook her his mother's favorite dishes, to finally meet the woman who, in his words, made him believe people could still care without wanting anything in return. To Marilyn, it sounded like a fairy tale. To her friends, it sounded like madness. When she told her church circle during Wednesday lunch, the table fell silent. Barbara Hayes, her longtime friend and neighbor, was the first to speak. "Marilyn, I love you, but are you sure this man is real? I mean, you've never seen him in person." Another friend, Lottie, leaned in. "People disappear on trips like that. You watch the news." Marilyn smiled gently, stirring her iced tea. "He's the first man who's seen me in years. Not as a nurse, not as someone's mother or widow, just as me." Her tone wasn't defensive. It was tender, almost fragile. She wasn't arguing with them. She was explaining a feeling they couldn't understand. Celeste didn't take the news well either. When Marilyn mentioned her plans, her daughter nearly dropped her phone. "Mom, please don't tell me you're serious," she said, pacing the kitchen. "You don't even know who this man is." Marilyn laughed softly. "I know enough. He's gentle. He listens." Celeste exhaled in frustration. "You always see the best in people. That's what scares me." But Marilyn's mind was made up. She believed that life didn't hand out second chances often, and when it did, you couldn't let fear talk you out of it. The following days were filled with excitement. She visited the passport office, renewed her documents, and began shopping for light dresses fit for tropical weather. The clerks at the department store smiled when she told them she was traveling to Indonesia to meet someone special. "At 62?" one of them said playfully. Marilyn grinned and replied, "Love doesn't check IDs." She bought sunscreen, sandals, and a straw hat she didn't really need, but couldn't resist. For the first time in a long time, her mirror reflected a woman who looked forward to something. While Marilyn's excitement bloomed in Dallas, another scene unfolded across the ocean in Jakarta. Inside a dimly lit room, Arca sat in front of his laptop, eyes fixed on the glow of the screen. He was watching an interview, Jeffrey Dahmer's 1994 prison confession. The room was silent, except for the steady hum of the air conditioner. The reporter asked Dahmer why he killed, and the man on the screen replied, "I just wanted to keep them with me, always." Arca didn't flinch. His reflection overlapped the image on the screen, as if two faces had merged into one. He whispered, almost thoughtfully, "People trust too much." He clicked pause and opened a small notebook where he had been taking notes, phrases, mannerisms, details of control. On the desk beside him lay neatly arranged objects, ropes, gloves, and small glass bottles filled with chemicals labeled in Bahasa. He wasn't preparing for romance. He was preparing for an experiment. Later that week, Arka visited an old colonial house in Bekasi, an area just outside Jakarta. It stood half hidden by overgrown trees, the kind of place people passed by without a second glance. The landlord seemed eager to rent it out, unaware of the man's quiet calculations as he inspected the structure. Thick walls, reinforced locks, a basement once used for storage. Perfect. Arka nodded and said he would take it. He told the owner he wanted privacy for his art projects. What he didn't say was that he'd already imagined who would stand inside those walls. Back in Dallas, Marilyn was preparing to surprise him. She printed one of his pictures, a photo of him smiling by the ocean, and placed it in her wallet. Sometimes, she'd pull it out at breakfast just to look at it. Soon, she'd whisper to herself, unaware that the man behind that smile wasn't who she believed him to be. He often told her he was busy setting things up for her arrival, explaining that his phone camera was broken, which was why he couldn't video call as often. She didn't question it. Love, especially late in life, makes excuses that reason can't argue with. In Jakarta, Arka began recording video journals. He'd stare into the camera with a calm face, his tone eerily measured. "Trust is easy," he said in one recording. "It's the purest kind of weakness. People give it freely, and when you take it, they call you evil." He saved the video under a folder titled Understanding. His fascination with Dahmer had long crossed the line between study and imitation. Days turned into weeks. Marilyn counted down the days until she would finally meet him. She mailed Celeste a copy of her travel itinerary, promising to call as soon as she landed. Celeste tried one last time to change her mind. "Mom, please just think about it. What if he's not who he says he is?" Marilyn touched her daughter's hand and smiled. "Honey, all my life I've believed in people. It's too late to stop now." By late November, her suitcase sat by the door, neatly packed. On her nightstand was the letter Arka sent, handwritten and mailed to her address. The ink was faintly smudged, but the words were steady. "You have healed the world, Marilyn. Now it's time someone heals you. Trust me." Arka watched the news that same night as a segment aired on unsolved disappearances of foreign women across Southeast Asia. His expression didn't change. He switched off the television and stared into the dark window where his own reflection stared back. For a long moment, he simply smiled. Marilyn went to bed imagining beaches and laughter. Arka went to bed imagining control and silence. Thousands of miles apart, both were waiting for December, the month when their worlds would finally meet. At what point does love blind us from danger? Would you fly halfway across the world for someone you've never met in person? The moment Marilyn stepped off the plane at Soekarno-Hatta International Airport, the air hit her like a wall. Thick, heavy, and foreign. She paused for a second, clutching the handle of her suitcase as the warmth wrapped around her like a damp blanket. The noise was constant. Voices overlapping, luggage wheels clattering, drivers shouting names on placards. For a brief second, she thought of turning back, of sitting in the terminal until her connecting flight took her anywhere else. But then she saw him. Arka. He stood near the exit, holding a bouquet of tropical flowers. For months, she had imagined this moment. The hug, the smile, the first look. But when it finally came, something felt off. His smile didn't reach his eyes. They were darker than she remembered from the photos, sharper somehow. Still, when he leaned in to hug her, she let herself melt into it. "You're finally here," he said quietly. His voice was soft, but there was a distance in it, as though the warmth she'd heard for months online had been left behind in their messages. The drive from Jakarta was long and winding. He told her they were heading to a village outside the city, somewhere peaceful, away from traffic and noise. She didn't mind. After all, she'd always preferred quiet over chaos. But as the road turned from smooth pavement to uneven gravel, unease began to whisper at the edge of her thoughts. The city lights faded behind them, replaced by endless stretches of trees and dark open fields. She looked out the window, trying to catch a signal on her phone, but the bars disappeared one by one. "We're almost there," Arca said, eyes fixed on the road. The house appeared at the end of a narrow path, hidden behind tall iron gates. From the outside, it looked old but well kept, painted in a dull shade of cream that glowed faintly under the moonlight. "It's quieter here," he said, unlocking the gate. "You'll be safe." Safe. The word didn't land right. She smiled politely anyway, pretending not to notice the rusted chains looped around one side of the gate or the overgrown plants creeping up the wall. Inside, the air was thick with an odor she couldn't place, something metallic mixed with damp wood and old air. She wrinkled her nose. "Do you smell that?" she asked. "Old plumbing," he replied too quickly, tossing her suitcase aside. "I'll fix it tomorrow." That night, she tried to settle in. The house was dimly lit, and most of the windows were covered by thick curtains. Even the mirrors were partially hidden. At dinner, Arca barely spoke. He ate quickly, eyes down, and left her at the table. When she tried to thank him for picking her up, he simply nodded. Later, she sat on the bed scrolling through photos of home, the garden she missed, the framed picture of Celeste, the small Bible on her nightstand back in Dallas. She decided to call her daughter. The video connected after several attempts. Celeste's face appeared, blurry but bright. "Mom, you made it," she said, smiling. Marilyn smiled back but hesitated. "Yes, I'm here. It's different." Celeste laughed. "Of course it is. You're halfway across the world." Marilyn glanced toward the door where Arca had disappeared moments earlier. "He's different in person, too. Colder." Celeste frowned. "Colder how?" Marilyn hesitated. "I don't know. Just distant." The line glitched. Celeste's voice crackled. "Be careful, okay? Promise me." Marilyn nodded, forcing a smile. "I promise." She ended the call quickly when she heard footsteps approaching. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the cracks of the curtains, and for a moment it almost felt like home. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, but it wasn't there. Her heart skipped. She checked her purse, her luggage. Nothing. "Arca?" she called out. He appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of tea. "You're awake," he said calmly. "I took your phone. It's charging." She frowned. "You could have told me." He shrugged, setting the cup down. "You worry too much." His tone was soft but final, as if questioning him was no longer part of the arrangement. As the hours passed, small things began to feel wrong. The house was too quiet. There was no television, no radio, not even the hum of passing traffic. The only sounds were the faint creaks of the old wooden floor and the occasional drip of water from the kitchen sink. When she asked to step outside, he said it was best to stay in until she adjusted to the climate. When she offered to help cook, he told her to rest. He chose what she ate, when she slept, and how she spent her day. His affection became mechanical, morning smiles followed by long silences. By the third day, her stomach twisted with unease. Arca's mood began to shift without warning. One moment, he was gentle, telling her stories about the ocean and childhood memories. The next, he grew irritable if she asked simple questions. Once, she mentioned the smell in the hallway again, and he slammed his hand on the counter. "Enough about that smell," he snapped, then immediately softened, touching her arm. "I'm sorry. I'm just tired." She nodded, too startled to respond. That night, unable to sleep, Marilyn decided to explore quietly. She tiptoed into the hallway and noticed for the first time that several interior doors had padlocks. She tried one. Locked. Another. Also locked. The third door creaked slightly, revealing a glimpse of what looked like a storage room. On a shelf, she spotted framed photographs. Women she didn't recognize. Their faces were blurred, old and faded, but one detail caught her breath. In every photo, the women were standing in front of the same wall she'd seen near the basement, the same peeling paint, the same pattern. Her pulse quickened. She stepped back and shut the door quietly. As she turned, she saw Arca standing at the end of the hall. "Can't sleep?" he asked. His face was calm, but his eyes were unreadable. No, she said softly. Just restless. He nodded slowly. You should rest. You're safe here. The words felt colder than the air. Over the following days, the control deepened. Arka decided when she could bathe, how long she could use the phone, and even where she could sit. When she asked about returning to the city, he laughed and said, "Why would you want to leave paradise?" His tone was teasing, but his stare wasn't. She learned to hide her discomfort behind small smiles and careful words. By the end of the week, her laughter was gone. The hope that had carried her across the ocean began to unravel, thread by thread. She still believed she could reason with him, that maybe loneliness had just made her misread his nature. But deep inside, she felt something tightening around her, an invisible hand closing slowly. One evening, as the rain poured outside, she whispered to herself, "You wanted love, not a cage." The thunder drowned her words. Would you trust your instincts or your hope? Because sometimes, the line between the two disappears the moment you stop listening to the voice that tries to save you. Thank you for being part of this story. Your support helps us bring real cases like this to light. If this story moved you, share it, to remind someone that love should never come at the cost of safety. March 1st, 2022, 11:38 p.m. The house in Bekasi held its breath while the rain pressed against the shutters, and Marilyn woke to a glow seeping under her bedroom door, thin and steady like a pulse. She slid her feet into her slippers, eased the latch, and peered down the hall where a blue light flickered from the sitting room. Arka sat in front of the laptop with the volume low, his shoulders relaxed and his face set in a stillness she had never seen. On the screen, a prison interview played. The American voice measured, the words clinical. She recognized the name before the face, Jeffrey Dahmer, because grief has a way of storing strange facts, and nurses learn more than they ever wanted about the worst of men. She stepped closer and whispered his name, and Arka didn't turn. He only nodded as if she'd interrupted a prayer. He wasn't evil, he said, closing the laptop halfway so the light cut across his eyes. He was misunderstood. Her laugh came too quickly and sounded like it belonged to a stranger, a high, thin sound that tried to diffuse a moment that would not loosen. She reached for a blanket on the arm of a chair and pulled it around herself, saying that killers couldn't be explained with soft words, and that wound care taught her some things never heal. Arka didn't smile, and he didn't argue. He simply watched her as if weighing a response and then said, "People judge what they fear," which landed between them like a small stone dropped into a deep well. She felt the room tilt, not because of his sentence, but because of the way he said it. Calm, patient, certain, and she told herself it was late, and that jet lag could turn any conversation sour. He put the laptop to sleep and said she should rest, that the storm would pass by morning and the air would be clear again. She walked back to the bedroom with the blanket still around her shoulders, and the sound of the laptop hinge closing chased her like a whisper she couldn't shake. The night stretched on, and the house filled with small sounds that didn't match the hour. There was a faint hum beneath the floorboards like a stubborn appliance. There was a drip that wasn't the leaky kitchen tap because it came from deeper inside the structure, and there was a slow, irregular scrape like metal dragged over concrete. She lay still and counted between the noises, telling herself it was the heat expanding old pipes, then telling herself that old pipes don't drag, then telling herself she was being dramatic, because a woman alone can talk herself into safety long after safety has left. The smell that had bothered her since she arrived thickened, not sharp enough to choke her, but strong enough to cling to the back of her throat, a sour, metallic note cut with something chemical. The clock rolled past 1:13 a.m., and the hum under the bed vibrated softly through the frame, and she finally stood because staying still felt worse than moving. In the hallway, the air felt heavier, the odor stronger, and the wind outside had started to quiet, which made the indoor noises feel louder and more honest. She found Arka in the kitchen washing a glass he had not used, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his eyes set on a point beyond her shoulder. She asked about the smell again as gently as she knew how, saying she worried it might make them sick, and he dried the glass without looking up. "You smell fear," he said. And the words were soft, but they closed the space between them like a door. She swallowed, apologized without knowing why, and said she would make tea, and he reached past her to place the kettle on the stove as if she had asked for permission and he had granted it. The burner clicked 3 times before it caught, and in those seconds of silence she heard the drag again. Longer now, answered by the hum that seemed to live under the back half of the house. Arca turned off the burner before the water could heat and said he had things to do in the morning and she should sleep. She nodded because arguing would only confirm his assessment, and she backed out of the kitchen without turning her back on him. By 2:06 a.m., she lay under the sheet with her eyes open and her breathing shallow, and she decided on a simple plan that felt like common sense more than fear. She would pretend to sleep, wait for his footsteps to fade, and learn the house well enough to find peace of mind. The hallway swallowed her slowly as she eased the door open with the care of a nurse unwrapping a dressing, and she moved barefoot across the boards that did not creak, counting each quiet step. The first door she tried was locked with a rusting padlock that had been polished by use. The second had a latch on the outside rather than the inside, and the third gave a fraction when she pressed, opening into a narrow room where the smell lifted like a curtain. A metal shelf sat against the wall with brown glass jars labeled in Bahasa, and a narrow stainless tray held scissors, hemostats, and scalpels lined like silver teeth, each wrapped in paper sleeves that looked recently torn. She touched nothing. She moved nothing, and still the room felt disturbed the moment she breathed inside it. At the end of the hallway, a door she had not noticed before stood flush with the wall, the paint newer than the rest and the handle colder. When she pressed, it did not open, but when she slid her fingers along the jamb, she found a second lock sunk into the frame and a keyhole that had been painted over. Cool air seeped through the seam like breath from a mouth, and the odor gathered into something focused and sterile. Formaldehyde, a scent she knew from years of hospital storage rooms and anatomy labs where learning began, with loss. She pulled back quickly, steadying herself with a hand on the wall, and told herself that any house this old could have a cold storage room. Yet she could not find a kitchen large enough to need it, or a pantry that justified it. On a small side table sat a plain black USB drive labeled by hand with a single word, "Memories," written in a tidy script that matched the notes she'd seen near the desk downstairs. She placed it in her robe pocket without letting herself think about why, then closed the door she had opened and pressed the latch into place until it clicked. The sitting room lamp still held a last coil of warmth, and the laptop rested on the table where Arca had left it, its lid light as a breath. She told herself she would look only long enough to satisfy caution. That knowledge is sometimes the only safe gift we can give ourselves, and she slid the USB into the port with hands that did not shake. The screen woke to a folder that opened on its own, and a grid of thumbnails appeared. Still frames of women standing in unfamiliar rooms, each looking toward a camera as if answering an instruction. She chose one without thinking, and a video filled the screen in a rush of color and quiet. A woman about her age stood against a white wall with paint peeling in small curls, the same wall Marilyn had seen near the basement door. And the woman smiled too hard, the way people smile when they want to please. A voice off camera, calm, patient, asked her name, and the woman answered with a tremble, then corrected herself, and then tried to laugh. Another clip began without her touching the keyboard, and the same voice asked another woman to turn left, then right, then sit. The tone as gentle as a nurse giving directions before a scan. The camera didn't shake, the angle didn't change, and the seconds stretched long enough for a kind of dread to build in the quiet. A third video opened to a close frame of hands, 2 sets, one resting on the other in a gesture that might almost look kind if the background hadn't been that same wall, if the audio hadn't carried the soft scratch of chain links settling. She swallowed a sound that rose in her throat, because panic wastes air, and she was a woman who understood oxygen better than most. The fourth clip began, and there she was, the woman in the floral dress from the drawer upstairs, standing in this same house months earlier, her eyes glossy, her breathing too fast, her voice reaching for steady and never finding it. The camera lens held her like a pin holds an insect, and the off-camera voice asked what she was most grateful for, then told her to speak louder when the answer came out thin. Marilyn reached for the keyboard with hands that felt unreliable and paused the video at the frame where the woman's eyes met the camera, because the plea there was louder than any sound the room could hold. She stared at the frozen image and felt the hum under her feet again, the drip in the walls, the scrape of metal deeper in the house, and she knew those weren't the noises of old plumbing. The door behind her creaked once, a soft hinge made loud by the hour, and cool air from the hallway moved across the back of her neck like a warning. She didn't turn at first because the instinct to freeze can be stronger than the instinct to run, and nurses know that sudden movement can make a bad situation worse. She lowered the laptop lid an inch, because denial is a reflex we practice from childhood, and the room dimmed just enough for the blue light to paint the outline of a figure in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep?" Arca asked, and the words were light, but they carried weight that pressed on her chest. She lifted her chin slowly because meeting a gaze can be a shield, and she said she was looking for a charger, which was partly true, and she said she had gotten lost in the folders, which was not, and she waited for the sound of his steps to tell her what the next minute would be. He didn't move closer, not at once, and the pause felt like a coin spinning on a table, ready to fall one way or the other. Then he smiled with only part of his mouth and said, "You always want to understand everything," as if it were praise, and he walked past her to the window and pulled the curtain closed, although there was nothing to see. She slid the USB from the port and folded it into her palm, the plastic small and sharp against her skin, and the laptop went dark with a soft sigh. He stood with his back to her for a full breath and then said, "It's late." The words laid down like a line across the floor. She told him she would sleep, and she stood slowly, and she walked past him with the kind of calm that shame often imitates, because she needed him to believe she had seen nothing of meaning, and she needed one more night to plan. Down the hall, the locked doors seemed to watch her as she moved, and the cold seam of the refrigerator room kissed her ankles as she passed, and the railing under her hand felt damp from air that shouldn't have been wet. She reached her room, closed the door, and leaned against it until her breathing learned a gentler rhythm. The USB sat in her palm like a pulse that wasn't hers, and she hid it under the sole of a shoe in her suitcase, because hiding small things can feel like the only power left. Sleep did not come, but she lay down anyway, because lying still can pass for sleep to someone who doesn't look closely, and she needed him to stop looking closely until morning. She counted the hums, she counted the drips, she counted the scrapes, and she told herself that patience could be the difference between home and never. If you found evidence that your partner had hurt others, would you run, or pretend nothing happened until you could escape? March 2nd, 2022, 10:48 p.m. She lay awake rehearsing the plan in slow, careful loops. At first light, she would take the keys from the hook by the kitchen door, slip out through the side entry, cross the small yard past the water tank, and run for the main road where trucks sometimes passed before sunrise. She had already tucked the flash drive under the insole of her shoe and practiced breathing through panic the way she had taught anxious patients, counting 4 in and 6 out until her chest loosened. The house breathed with her, every hum and drip and distant scrape falling into a rhythm she could read like a monitor, and she timed his movements too, the way his steps slowed near midnight and the kettle clicked at 6 a.m. on schedule. Dawn would give cover and distance, and if she kept her steps quiet, she told herself, she could be through the gate before he even left his room. She was so close to sleep that hope almost felt like rest when the front gate clanged, and the sound cut the night in half. He returned earlier than usual with a plastic bag and a smile that didn't belong to any hour, saying the air was cooler now and that tea would help her settle. And she answered softly because refusal can be dangerous when someone measures your tone. He set the cup in her hands with a gentleness that didn't match the hard light in his eyes, and when she lifted it, a faint chemical tang climbed the steam, not strong enough to accuse, but wrong enough to warn. She tilted the cup against her lip, let the liquid kiss her tongue, then coughed lightly and spilled a ribbon down her sleeve, apologizing with a laugh while the rest of the tea dripped quietly into the blanket pulled across her lap. He watched the stain, not her face, then nodded as if convinced. And she lifted the cup again, pressing it to her mouth while letting the liquid slide down her chin in a thin line she hid with her wrist. Minutes stretched. The room tilted. The edges of objects grew soft, and she knew some of it had reached her blood because the floor felt further away than it should, and then everything folded into black. When the world returned, it did so in pieces. Cold air on her ankles, concrete pressing her spine, a light bulb humming overhead like an insect trapped in glass. Her wrists were bound to a steel ring bolted into the wall, the skin already burning where the ties cut. Her ankles were cinched to a pipe, tight enough to bite but not tight enough to numb. Arca stood a few feet away holding a small handheld camera, his eyes bright and satisfied, narrating in a soft, almost admiring tone while the red light winked. "You're special," he said, as if he were offering comfort instead of a sentence. "I won't waste you like the others." The room answered with a drip that found a metal pan and an echo, and she swallowed hard to keep from giving him the sound of her fear. She asked for water to stall and to wet her mouth enough to form steady words, and when he turned for a pitcher, she scanned the floor with a nurse's eye trained to find tools in chaos. There, near the leg of a steel table, lay a crescent of broken glass, thin as a fingernail and mean as a promise. He returned and tipped a cup against her lips with practiced care, and she let a little in, then coughed, and as his hand moved to her shoulder, she rolled her wrist to gauge the give in the binding, testing for heat-swollen space she could widen. She breathed slow to lower her heart rate, pressing the medial edge of her right wrist against the shard, feeling for the soft groove between tendons where skin thins and vessels run shallow, staying clear of the radial artery by feel and memory. The first drag of glass tore skin and set fire racing up her arm, but pain, like bleeding, can be controlled with pressure and purpose, and she cut again, small and quick, until the binding loosened enough for her thumb to fold and her hand to slip. He noticed the shift in her posture and stepped closer, smiling as if she had just proven a theory. Then he moved so fast the camera blurred. The blow came in a white arc and landed near her eye with a hot, electric crack, and the world flashed with stars that didn't belong to any sky. Wet warmth ran down her cheek, and one side of vision turned to a smear. He raised the blade again, short, surgical, precise, and she turned her face and felt the slice catch skin instead of the orb it reached for, and she heard her own voice leave her throat in a sound she didn't recognize. Instinct reached where thought couldn't, and her free hand found the glass beaker behind her heel. She came up with it in a single, desperate swing, the weight surprising her, the aim guided by pain. It shattered against his cheek with a hollow pop that belonged in a lab, not a basement, and shards flew, and blood came bright and sudden, and he staggered with a sound that was more shock than fury. The camera clattered to the floor and skittered under the table, its red eye still blinking. He lunged, and she kicked wildly, catching his shin and then his knee, enough to buy a breath. She curled forward, sliced at the last of the wrist tie with the blood-slick shard, and pulled free with a gasp that tasted like iron. The ankle restraint fought harder, thick, wet with her own sweat, and she twisted until skin burned, then jammed the glass under the strap and sawed, counting breaths to hold back panic because panic eats time. He reached for her hair and missed, his hand slick with his own blood. He swore softly in Bahasa, the words low and intimate, and reached again with the other hand, but she rolled toward the table and shoved it with her shoulder. It slid an inch, then another, knocking a tray into the wall with a clatter that rang like an alarm, and for the first time since waking, the house felt like it was listening. The strap gave, cruelly and all at once, and she kicked free, dragged herself toward the stairs, and crawled because standing would waste the seconds she had bought. Her vision doubled the steps, but her hands knew wood, and her knees knew rise and run. He grabbed at her ankle and caught only air, and she left a streak behind her that marked both path and proof, and the sound of his breath behind her grew ragged and close. She reached the door at the top of the stairs, found the lock, and twisted until her wrist screamed, then slammed her shoulder into the panel, and the old wood complained but moved. She stumbled into the hall, the light harsher here, and screamed from a place below language, a long ripped sound that didn't ask for help so much as announce a will to live. The gate outside was still locked, the night still thick, but sound travels farther than hope when the world is quiet, and the world beyond the wall heard her. Across the narrow lane, Rendra Sutomo stood up from his small workbench where he had been filing a bracket for a motorbike, and listened, because he knew the sounds houses make, and he knew when a voice is not a house. He stepped into the yard and heard it again, raw, tearing, real, and he felt the hair on his arms rise as he reached for his phone with hands that were steadier than he expected. "Police," he said into the receiver, giving the address twice, his voice low to keep the line clear. "I think someone is being hurt. Please come now." And he stayed outside because staying outside felt like guard duty and witness at once. Inside the house, Arca reached the hall with a stagger and left small red crescents on the wall where his fingers slid, and he called her name almost gently, as if coaxing a child from hiding, and she pressed herself against the doorframe and screamed again, louder, forcing air through pain and fear until her own sound steadied her. The blood from her brow and cheek ran into her eye and turned the hallway into streaks of light and shadow, but the shape of the latch was clear enough, and she dropped the last of the strap from her ankle and kicked it aside as if shedding a molting skin. He came close enough that she could smell the copper on his breath, and she threw herself forward, shoulder first, into the side door that led to the courtyard. The bolt scraped, stuck, then gave, and night air hit her face like water, bright and warm. She stumbled across the small square of ground, toes digging into wet soil, and grabbed the iron bars of the outer gate with both hands, shaking them so hard her ribs ached, and she screamed for anyone and everyone and for herself. A porch light across the lane snapped on, another neighbor's window opened, a dog began to bark without pause, and Rendra called out, "We hear you!" Because sometimes the first gift you can give a stranger is your voice. Behind her, Arca stood in the doorway, blood washing his cheek, the handheld camera now dark at his feet, and for a second he simply watched, measuring distance and options and noise, and then the distant wail of sirens began to thread the night. She held the bars and didn't let go, even when her hands slipped, even when her body shook, even when his steps came closer again, because hands on iron felt like proof she still belonged to the world outside the door. The sirens grew louder. Rendra moved closer to the wall and shouted that help was coming. A second dog joined the first, and voices gathered like a tide beyond the lane. Inside her chest, something shifted from terror to purpose, not because the pain lessened, but because the sound of response told her she had moved the story 1 inch toward life. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that survival is not a feeling, but a series of small choices made while hurt. And she chose to keep her hands on the gate and her voice in the air until the blue lights turned the wet street into a river. How much pain can a human endure before fear becomes the will to live? The night air around Bekasi was heavy with humidity when the convoy of police trucks rolled to a stop at the end of the narrow dirt road. Their headlights cut through the mist and fell on the pale colonial house that stood silent behind rusted gates. Inside, faint movement flickered through the windows, shadows that didn't belong to the wind. The officers moved quickly, splitting into teams. At the front, Inspector Bayu Santoso, a man who had seen too many crime scenes and too little justice, motioned for the breach. The battering ram hit once, twice. Then the gate gave way with a scream of metal. They entered shouting commands, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. The smell hit them first, chemical, sour, and sweet all at once, the unmistakable scent of decay masked by bleach. One of the officers gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The walls were bare except for faint smears that no one wanted to identify yet. They moved deeper until they heard something, soft, uneven breathing, followed by a weak cry for help. In a small locked room near the hall, they found her. Marilyn Ford, 62 years old, barefoot, bruised, blood dried against her cheek. She sat against the wall, one arm still chained to a metal pipe. Her good eye blinked slowly, trying to focus on the beam of light. The first officer dropped to his knees. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She nodded faintly. Her voice came as a whisper. "He's downstairs." They unchained her carefully, her wrists trembling as metal clinked to the floor. "He's downstairs," she repeated, her voice steadying now. 2 officers stayed with her while the others followed the trail of dark stains leading toward the basement. The door was already open. The first step down was slick, the air colder. Their boots echoed against concrete. One flashlight beam caught a row of jars lined neatly on a shelf. The liquid inside shimmered faintly, and what floated there froze the room in silence. Human tissue, preserved in formaldehyde, labeled by date. 6 of them. Nearby, a refrigeration unit hummed softly. When the door swung open, the truth unfolded in fragments. Partial remains sealed in plastic, organs arranged with disturbing precision, fragments of clothing folded beside them like mementos. Detective Santoso whispered, "Dear God," as another officer pulled out a notebook filled with neat handwriting. Each page listed details, names, ages, nationalities, brief notes about trust, emotion, fear response. It was half journal, half study. On the opposite table, a small camera sat connected to a laptop. The footage on the screen showed Arca sitting in front of it, speaking in English. "They loved easily," he said in one clip, smiling faintly. "Love makes them blind. That's when I can see them clearly." In another video, he stood over a woman who wasn't moving, speaking gently to the camera. "Pain teaches truth. When they stop lying, I stop cutting." Outside the room, one officer vomited. Another muttered a prayer. The evidence was overwhelming, yet eerily organized. No chaos, no frenzy. Everything was arranged like a ritual of control. On the wall behind the work table hung a map of Southeast Asia, red pins marking cities: Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Manila, and Jakarta. Underneath, written in English, were the words, "Foreign hearts, local silence." Upstairs, Marilyn tried to stand. "He recorded everything," she told the paramedic. "He said it was research, that he wanted to understand people who couldn't say no." Her voice cracked, not from pain, but from the weight of remembering. Detectives soon pieced together the pattern. Each victim was an older woman, traveling alone, drawn to Indonesia through online relationships that seemed harmless at first. Arca targeted women whose loneliness mirrored the same kindness that had once saved lives in their own professions: nurses, teachers, caregivers, women who trusted too quickly, women who believed love could heal. Forensics worked through the night, cataloging every detail. Beneath the jars, they found diaries with titles like Study of Affection and The Anatomy of Trust. In one entry, Arca wrote, "Empathy is the most beautiful weapon. Once they believe you feel their pain, they will give you everything." In another, he described his fascination with Jeffrey Dahmer, not as a fan, but as a student. Dahmer's obsession with control inspired him, yet he believed he could improve it. "He wasted them," Arca had written. "He ended the lesson too soon. I will keep them longer. I will understand more." The autopsy reports later revealed a disturbing precision. The organs were preserved perfectly, some showing surgical removal. Investigators realized he had studied human anatomy extensively, likely through illegal medical forms. He documented every victim, recording changes in their emotional responses, even tracking how quickly fear gave way to compliance. When asked by reporters later how such a man went unnoticed, Detective Santoso said quietly, "He didn't hide like monsters do. He blended in like a friend." Meanwhile, forensic psychologists reviewed the footage Arca had left behind. In one recording, he spoke directly to the camera as if delivering a lecture. "People think monsters lack empathy," he said. "That's wrong. Empathy is how I reach them. It's how I make them trust me. You can't destroy what you don't first understand." His journals revealed that he saw himself not as a killer, but as a collector of emotions. Each preserved piece, each labeled organ, represented a stage of connection, a grotesque attempt to hold on to intimacy forever. The most haunting discovery wasn't physical, it was emotional. Among the artifacts, officers found small keepsakes from each victim: a bracelet, a photo, a letter written in a foreign language. Each item was tagged with notes like "Joy when promised forever," or fear when realizing truth. By dawn, the house had become a crime scene swarmed with investigators, forensic teams, and press vans lining the narrow street. The morning light revealed what darkness had hidden, the scale of his ritual, the precision of his madness. Marilyn, wrapped in a blanket, watched through the ambulance window as officers carried evidence boxes past her. When Detective Santoso approached, she met his eyes and said, "He thought love made people weak. He was wrong." Santoso nodded, his expression heavy. He underestimated what survival looks like. Later reports confirmed that Arca had no documented psychiatric history. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who helped carry groceries. He volunteered occasionally at a local clinic and spoke English fluently. His victims never stood a chance of seeing what he truly was, a man who turned empathy into a weapon. The footage, combined with his notes, would eventually make this one of the most disturbing cases in Indonesia's criminal archives, a modern echo of Dahmer's legacy, rewritten through cultural disguise. As the documentary closes on that moment, the image freezes on the evidence table. 6 jars lined perfectly under the bright forensic light, each one representing a story that began with trust and ended in terror. The camera pans to Marilyn's hospital room, where her surviving eye stares out the window, distant yet defiant. She says quietly, "He studied how love works, but he never learned what it means. Can empathy become dangerous when it's misplaced? What happens when loneliness meets obsession, and someone decides to call that love?" The question lingers longer than the credits, leaving the audience in the uneasy silence between pity and horror. August 2022. The first day of court was humid and crowded, the air thick with heat and curiosity. Journalists filled the steps outside the Jakarta High Court, cameras flashing as officers led Arca Wibowo into the building. He wore a plain white shirt, his wrists bound, his expression unreadable. He didn't look frightened or regretful. If anything, he looked proud. When reporters shouted questions, asking if he regretted what he'd done, he smiled faintly and said, "Jeffrey Dahmer was a pioneer. He taught us how fragile love really is." The crowd gasped, and for a moment, the flash of cameras turned the courtroom entrance into a lightning storm. Inside, the trial drew national attention. 6 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder. Evidence boxes filled the courtroom floor, labeled photographs, jars sealed with evidence tags, and a black USB drive that contained hours of footage too disturbing for public broadcast. Marilyn Ford sat in the front row, a navy headscarf covering her bandages, her single eye fixed on the man who had turned her kindness into survival. Each time his voice echoed through the courtroom, her fingers trembled, but her gaze never faltered. The prosecution built its case slowly, layering fact over horror. They showed how Arca had studied Dahmer's interviews, repeating his words in his journals, imitating his control, even cataloging his victims as emotional specimens. They presented notes that tracked each woman's behavior, how trust deepened, how fear began, how resistance died. In one entry, he wrote, "When they stop asking questions, that's when the experiment succeeds." The courtroom fell silent. When it was Marilyn's turn to testify, the room shifted. She walked to the stand with slow, steady steps, the white of her eye patch stark against her skin. The judge asked if she was ready. She nodded once. Her voice was soft at first, but it carried. "He took my eye," she said, pausing long enough for the words to settle. "But not my soul." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the silence broke into the faint rustle of reporters typing and the quiet sound of someone crying in the gallery. The moment went viral within hours. Across Indonesia and beyond, her words became a symbol of defiance, the voice of every survivor who had looked evil in the eye and lived. Arca sat through her testimony without blinking. When the prosecutor asked if he wanted to respond, he only smiled and said, "She survived. That makes her my greatest work." Even the guards beside him flinched. The defense tried to frame him as mentally unstable, claiming years of childhood trauma and psychological breakdown. But the psychiatrists who examined him disagreed. Their report was clear. The subject demonstrates high cognitive control, full awareness of right and wrong, and consistent rational planning. He is not insane. He is predatory. By February 2023, the evidence was overwhelming. The videos, the journals, the remains, all spoke louder than any testimony. The prosecutor's closing argument was brief. He wanted understanding, she said, looking directly at Arca. Now the law will help him understand consequence. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. The judge read the sentence in a low, firm voice. Death by firing squad under Indonesian law. Marilyn closed her eyes. Arca's expression didn't change. He smiled again, that same calm curve of lips that once charmed strangers online. "People will remember me," he whispered as officers led him away. "That's what matters." Outside, rain began to fall, washing over the courthouse steps where people stood in stunned quiet. Some said justice had been done. Others wondered if justice could ever balance the weight of what had happened. Months later, when the execution date was set, the media coverage reignited the debate. Why do killers like him crave recognition? Why do their stories draw millions of viewers, even those who claim to be horrified? Why do some monsters seek fame through fear? And why do we keep watching? Because even as we condemn them, we can't look away. If you've made it this far, drop "I'm still here" in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and let us know what justice means to you. 2023. The Texas sun felt different when Marilyn came home. It wasn't warmth she felt, it was weight. Each step back into her quiet Dallas neighborhood brought memories of a life she could barely recognize anymore. The walls of her house still carried family photos, her laughter frozen in time, her late husband's face smiling from the mantel. But now, when she looked at those pictures, she saw a woman who once believed kindness could fix anything. That version of her was gone, and in her place stood someone learning how to live with both trauma and truth. Her daughter, Celeste, refused to let the story end with pain. She created the Mercy Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to protecting women from online predators and romance scams. Within months, it gained national attention, partnering with law enforcement and cybersecurity experts to teach women how to recognize manipulation long before it becomes danger. Celeste called it the fight her mother almost couldn't finish. Marilyn's recovery was long and grueling. Between therapy sessions and surgeries, she faced nightmares that didn't fade easily, but she turned each scar into testimony. On stage, she spoke to crowds of women who had once felt unseen, her voice steady, her words simple but piercing. "I wanted love. What I got was a lesson that nearly cost me everything." Every time she said it, silence followed, not out of pity, but reverence. She didn't tell her story for sympathy. She told it to save someone else's life. By mid-2024, Marilyn had become an advocate whose pain carried purpose. Her speeches traveled from small church halls to national conferences. News outlets quoted her now famous line, "I thought I found love online. What I found was the devil with Wi-Fi." It became a global warning, echoing across social media, reminding millions that predators don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they smile through a screen. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the investigation deepened. Authorities reopened several cold cases linked to Arca's aliases across Southeast Asia. 14 additional disappearances surfaced, women with similar stories, all believed to have vanished after meeting him through online groups or travel forums. Each revelation confirmed that Marilyn's survival wasn't just a miracle. It was the reason dozens of others might finally find justice. In the quiet moments after her speeches, Marilyn often sat alone, touching the thin ridge of scar beneath her eye patch. Healing hadn't been about forgetting. It had been about reclaiming her life from someone who tried to own it. She once said, "Survival isn't bravery. It's choosing to keep living when you've seen what fear really looks like." If survival is the opposite of fear, what would you choose? To love again or to never trust again? Every story like Marilyn's reminds us that monsters often wear the mask of what we crave most. Attention, affection, validation. But the truth is, safety begins long before danger appears. It begins with intuition, with boundaries, with saying no before it's too late. If you've ever felt unsafe in a relationship, talk to someone. Share your story. Speak up before silence becomes regret. Before you go, tell us what story you want covered next. Like, comment, and subscribe for more true crime stories.